Sir Edmund, just to start with, where did you grow up?
Well, I was actually born in Auckland, but my father was the editor of a country newspaper in the little town of Tuakau, just close to Pukekohe. So my first, I guess, 12 or 13 years, I lived out in the countryside at Tuakau.
And was it an active sort of childhood, a lot of sport and so on?
Well, not really in a way. My mother had been a school teacher, and she sort of helped me with my sort of academic work. So in this little primary school at Tuakau, I sort of became the child genius of the Tuakau primary school. And I passed all my exams very easily, and I was ready to go to high school when I was 11 instead of the ordinary 13. But I actually hadn't taken part in a great deal of sport. My mother had rather strict ideas about coming home from school promptly, and which didn't mean I didn't have lots of work to do around the place, but I took part in very little sport at that stage.
What was the lure, and when did the interest in climbing and trekking and so on begin?
Well, my mother was determined I would go to a good high school, so I was booked in at Auckland Grammar School. And for 3 years I travelled by train every day from Tuakau to Auckland and back again. I spent almost 4 hours really involved in travelling. And being only 11, I was much smaller than the majority of the kids in our form at grammar. But I remember in the last few years when I was there, I grew 6 inches one year and 5 inches the next year. By the time I left, I was relatively large as far as the grammar boys were concerned. But it was at grammar that I first had the opportunity to go to the mountains. It was when I was in the 7th form, and every year they had a 10-day trip down to Mount Ruapehu. And I think it must have been a good year for the honey business because my father agreed I should go. And I went by train down to the National Park station. We arrived at midnight and there was snow everywhere. It was absolutely fantastic. It was the first time I'd ever seen snow. And we had 10 marvellous days. And I knew then, actually, that I wanted to get back to the hills and back to the snow.
So did you do that often after that?
Well, I did quite a bit. Initially I did an awful lot of tramping, just in the Waitakere Ranges outside Auckland. But I also went on a number of skiing holidays. And it wasn't until some years later that I really started getting enthusiastic about mountaineering as such. I went down on quite a short trip to the Mount Cook area with a friend, and while I was there that first night, we were sitting in the lounge, and two rather redoubtable looking characters appeared in, and they had just climbed Mount Cook. And everybody sort of gathered all around them and they told the story of their climb, and I just listened open mouthed. I was absolutely overwhelmed with the excitement of it all. And I think then it was that I decided that if I got a chance, I was going to climb mountains like Mount Cook too.
I suppose it's not the sort of sport where you get coaching. Do you just look and learn, or learn by experience?
Well, you learn a lot by experience, and I certainly did, but even after I'd become a reasonably accomplished climber, I had the good fortune to make a very good friend of Harry Ayres, who was the outstanding guide in New Zealand mountaineering. And Harry and I worked together very well. I went climbing with him, or sometimes a companion and I would climb on the same climbs as Harry, who would have a customer along. And I learnt a tremendous lot about the skills of mountaineering, particularly on snow and ice. I learnt them from Harry. Harry was a remarkable climber. I would say certainly the best snow and ice climber that I have ever experienced.
Sir Edmund, when you were growing up, did you follow other sports? If not play them, did you follow them? And who were the sort of the sports stars that you were reading about and seeing?
Well, I didn't follow. No, I didn't follow a great deal of sports because I actually, in a way, I was a farm boy. My father had lots of bees, and every spare moment I used to be working at the bees. So I think I got very physically energetic and robust. I was lugging around, 80-pound boxes of honey all the time. And my brother and I were really quite competitive. We used to grab an 80-pound box of honey and race up to the truck to get it there first. And so I would have said in all the early years of my life, there probably wasn't any moment that I wasn't sort of physically energetic and pretty fit.
I was going to ask you about the beekeeping, which you went into business with your older brother, did you?
Yeah, originally we both went into business with my father. He took up beekeeping as a hobby. He was the editor of a country newspaper. But then he had so many hives of bees, he had to decide which he would follow. And so he went into beekeeping. And he had 1,600 hives of bees, which in those days, was quite a reasonable operation.
During the war, the RNZAF, you were involved with the flying boats, were you?
Yeah, I was in flying boats. I trained as a navigator, and we went up into the Pacific. And I have to admit that I found that the best holiday I'd ever had in my life. We didn't actually ever see a shot fired in anger. We were on search and rescue, and we did rescue the odd aircraft that had come down. But all the time up in the Pacific, one of my friends on the Catalina had a small boat, and we sailed all around the islands. We hunted crocodiles. We really had a most enjoyable time.
Yeah, just skipping ahead to your climbing again. In 1951, you made an expedition to Mount Everest with Eric Shipton, is that right?
Yeah, well, there was no doubt that during my years in the Air Force and so on, I'd always been a very keen reader. And I read lots and lots of books about Antarctic adventure and about Himalayan climbing. And I would have said that the heroes that I had at that time, Sir Ernest Shackleton in the Antarctic, was unquestionably, I regarded as a fantastic person, and Eric Shipton in the Himalayas. He'd been a great explorer and a very good climber indeed. And so when in 1951 we organised our New Zealand expedition, and we went off to the Indian Himalaya, and we climbed a lot of good peaks. And then two of us were invited to join Shipton for an Everest reconnaissance from the south side. Well, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. Eric Shipton certainly had been one of my heroes, and I very quickly became extremely friendly with him and developed a considerable admiration for him. He was my mentor in a way, even though I think by the time I had joined him, I was probably a better technical climber than he was. But he'd had a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge. The thing he was really good at was judging the danger of deep, soft snow. And he could assess avalanche danger very effectively. On the other hand, if it was just a matter of climbing something pretty steep or cutting steps, I think my background of experience had, well, I was the one that did all the leading in those sections. But it was a great experience for me climbing with Eric Shipton.
I'm just trying to get a feel for the way you were then. First of all, you mentioned Shackleton. Had you read about the great explorers Scott and Mallory and so on?
Yes, I'd read about them all, and I'd found it all, extremely exciting and stimulating. Mallory, of course, was the original inspiration of Everest, really. He was in on the first expedition there in 1931, and it was quite clear from the book written on the expedition that he was the dominant influence. He was the one that really decided what route was suitable to attempt, and he did all sorts of quite difficult reconnaissances, which showed that he was a man of great ability.
And at the same time, Everest, did that loom as large then, like the 4-minute mile, about the same time people trying to beat 4 minutes for the mile? Was Everest the big goal in those days for mountaineers?
Oh yes, it was, and a lot of that was due to George Lee Mallory. He became related, as it were, to Everest, and when anybody thought of Everest or attempts on the mountain, they thought of George Lee Mallory, and he did some very, very formidable attempts. Finally, of course, he put in his final attempt, and he disappeared and was never seen again. And I think even the fact that he had died on the mountain created a feeling that made the mountain even more impressive, perhaps, than it was before.
The 1951 visit with Shipton, did that stimulate you?
Oh, that was great fun, actually. There were two of us New Zealanders invited on that, and there were 3 or 4 very good English rock climbers, but they didn't really have all that much experience of snow and ice climbing. So I think that Earl Ridderford and myself had certain advantages. We were the ones really that pioneered the route up the icefall into the Western Coombe. We just knew how to cut steps and how to climb in difficult icy country, and we performed sufficiently well that we became one of the team. I found in life that if you're selected into a team and you do well and people like you reasonably well, that you're more or less in the team for as long as you can perform okay. And I guess that happens in rugby or cricket or anything else.
So can we just background, how did you come to be involved in Hunt's expedition a couple of years later?
Well, originally the expedition, the 1953 expedition, Eric Shipton had been chosen as leader. And Eric really he didn't really enjoy big expeditions. He was much more a great explorer with a small team. And I think his organizational skills on a big expedition were perhaps not as great as they could have been. Anyway, progress was proving a little slow on preparing the expedition, and the organizational committee in London decided that they wanted someone else who would push things along a bit faster. They didn't handle it at all well. They more or less made it a fait accompli to Eric, that he could either have a fellow leader or accept that someone else would do it. Eric immediately, of course, just pulled out. And John Hunt, who I had never heard of before, but who'd had quite a lot of experience and was a colonel in the army, he was appointed the leader.
What sort of a person was Hunt, as it turned out?
Well, John Hunt was a really good, he was a very competent climber, but he was also a very good PR man. You know, I had considerable doubts when I heard that the expedition leader was going to be an army colonel. You know, I wasn't all that stuck on sort of service leaders of expeditions. But I always remember when I first met John, I was in Kathmandu. I arrived at the British Embassy, he was already there. And I sort of walked towards this rather reddish-haired, slim gentleman. And as I approached him, he put his hand out and said, "Hello, Ed, I have been waiting to meet you for a long time." Well, of course, this was, I immediately thought, well, this fellow can't be all bad. And so he turned out. John Hunt was had a very good personality. He was very competent at handling the team. He was never a person who issued orders. There wasn't an order issued on the whole expedition. but he discussed the problems with the expedition members, and of course the final decisions were up to him, and we accepted them because he wasn't giving us orders, he was just basing them on good sound common fact.
Now there were two New Zealanders chosen, George Lowe and yourself.
Right.
Did you know George Lowe, and why were there two New Zealanders on this British expedition?
Well, George Lowe, I'd known George Lowe for many, many years, and we'd climbed together. And George was one of the outstanding New Zealand snow and ice climbers. He'd done a lot of very good climbing indeed, and he'd been, of course, to the Himalayas on a number of occasions. So one other person, Eric Shipton, had invited along at the recommendation of George Lowe and myself, had been my good old friend Harry Ayres. But John Hunt decided that two New Zealanders were enough, and so unfortunately he had to tell Harry Ayres that he was no longer invited. We've always felt this was a great mistake. I think if Harry Ayres had been there, he certainly would have been round about the top of the mountain when we were there.
When you arrived, I think there were 13 plus Sherpas. How many Sherpas would there be?
Well, we had various groups of Sherpas. The Sherpas in those days were always very strong, very good at altitude, able to carry big loads high up, but they didn't really have all that much technical experience. They were not really great mountaineers. And we had 25 what we called high altitude Sherpas. Sherpas who had proved that they could carry heavy loads to high altitude. But our members of the expedition, our Western members, we always escorted our Sherpas everywhere they went. We made sure they didn't get into any trouble. We established the routes, we put in fixed ropes, we put in rope ladders on steep ice sections, and we played a very important part in sort of making sure that the Sherpas got safely to their destination. Those things have changed very considerably now. There's no question that many of the Sherpas now, as happened with Swiss guides, have become very competent technically and are themselves able to lead difficult climbing.
Was one Sherpa much like another, or were there some clearly better than others?
Well, Tenzing Norgay, who was the Sirdar, which is sort of the manager of the Sherpas, he had a very impressive record. He'd done some excellent climbing, and we knew that he was rather better technically than the rest of the Sherpas. He couldn't carry any more load or anything, but as a climber he was much more formidable. Originally, George Lowe and I had always hoped that we would be able to climb together. And to tell you the truth, I haven't any doubt that if George and I had climbed as a team, it probably would have been George and myself who reached the summit of Everest. But John Hunt didn't want two New Zealanders just climbing together all the time. He wanted to split us up and for us to use our ice climbing techniques with other members of the party. So I had to look around for a suitable companion. And Tenzing was obviously very fit and moved extremely well on the mountain. So I went to the trouble to become very friendly with Tenzing, and we did a number of preliminary climbs together, and we sort of clicked as a very good combination.
I assume you didn't speak to each other?
Well, our speaking was relatively limited. I spoke very little Sherpa or Nepali, but Tenzing spoke slightly inadequate English. But we were able to communicate reasonably well on mountaineering problems. We couldn't discuss sort of the future of humanity or abstruse things of that nature, but we understood each other pretty well on the mountain.
What sort of a personality did he have?
Oh, he was a charming personality, very determined to be successful, very strong. He was big for a Sherpa, and great desire to be successful. He was one of the few shepherds really who wanted to get to the top of Mount Everest, and this of course made him pretty formidable. But he also had great charm. He had a flashing smile, extremely good-looking chap. I was a very crummy character compared to him, but he was a very good companion.
Well, once the climb started, was it obvious that you were going to be selected for the final push, or did that come later?
No, we worked on the mountain, all of us, pretty hard, and we put in a depot at 26,000 feet, which is sort of our final depot for the push towards the summit. And then we withdrew off the mountain for just for a few days to have a bit of rest, and it was only till then that the final decision was made as to who was going to do what. There were a lot of important jobs to do. The jobs of acting as backup to the summit teams. There was the job of attempting to reach the south summit of Mount Everest, which was higher than anybody had ever been before. And then there was the job of the final thrust towards the summit. I was involved in the discussion with John Hunt and with Charles Evans, who was the deputy leader. And there was really no question at all. I wasn't involved in the discussion as to who was going to be heading for the top. John Hunt and Charles Evans agreed that Tenzing and I were undoubtedly the fittest couple, and that we should be put in the position to have a attempt for the top. All the other jobs we discussed and worked out who seemed the most suitable people for them, and all of them actually carried out their tasks very competently indeed. We had a very good expedition, a very good team spirit, and a good leader.
Quite a thing to be chosen to go to the top. How selfless was everyone else, or could everyone else have done that?
Well, no, I don't think all of them could. I think as a team, our basic desire was that someone should get to the top. But I'm sure that all of us had the deep-seated feeling that we would quite like it to be us that were the ones who finally got there. And I think in that respect, Tenzing and I were probably the ones with the strongest feeling that we would like to set foot on the summit. And maybe that was one of the factors that gave us that extra little bit of drive when we were high on the mountain.
I mean, I have read that once that decision was made, they helped you husband your resources and so on. Is that true?
Well, to some degree, but only in the last sort of episode when we were going from our advanced base camp up the Lhotse face to the South Col. Tenzing and I still carried our loads and still led the route up to the South Col. But when we went from the South Col to establish our camp at nearly 28,000 feet, then we had 3 support members, one of whom was George Lowe. And there was a lot of step cutting to do up a snowy couloir onto the southeast ridge. And we were happy to let George, who was an excellent step cutter, to carry the burden for that. Tenzing and I were carrying heavy loads, but we did very little of the technical work on that section of the climb. And George, I believe that was his major effort really to our success, was his step cutting and leading up to nearly 28,000 feet. When we got to 28,000 feet, we found a place for a camp. George and Alf Gregory and one of our Sherpas, they dumped their gear there, said goodbye, and then they headed back down the mountain, back to the South Col. Then it was up to Tenzing and myself.
So when did they dump the gear there? What stage of the day?
Oh, it was about, I would say, early afternoon that we actually reached the campsite. And then we had to, it wasn't a very ideal campsite by any manner of means. It wasn't flat. It was quite sloping. We had to dig out two little ledges and pitch our tiny tent across them. And then we didn't really have any effective means of anchoring the tents down. And there were quite severe gusts of wind coming up every now and then. So what I had to do was I buried oxygen bottles as dead men in the snow roundabout and tied the tent ropes to them. I wasn't at all confident that this would be adequate, but it was the best we could do. Nowadays, of course, everybody would have pitons. I'd drive them into the cracks in the rock and they'd be very, very secure. But we weren't at all confident that our tent was going to be that secure.
So did you, excuse me, did you batten down the hatches for the night and then start the next day?
Yeah, I made all the preparations, and then after the tent was established, I sorted out the oxygen equipment, made sure that that was all ready, and then we crawled into the tent as darkness was coming and spent the night in the tent. We were actually 16 hours at our highest camp, and during that time we weren't using oxygen. We only used oxygen for 4 hours during the course of the night, and then at only 1 litre a minute, which was a very slow rate of flow of oxygen. But it really did have quite a substantial effect. During that 4 hours in the darkness, while we were breathing the oxygen, Tenzing and I slept very peacefully. But when the oxygen ran out, we woke up and it was very uncomfortable and rather unpleasant. I was rather pleased when the morning light started to return, and I was able to look out the tent door about 4:30 in the morning and see that the wind had eased off and that there were some clouds around, but on the whole it looked a climbing day.
Not many people go to bed thinking that in the morning they'll go to the top of Everest. Were you excited by that thought?
I was excited, but you know, even at that stage I had no sense of complete confidence that we were going to be successful. Quite a few people had been to 28,000 feet before and hadn't got very much further. And I knew the situation would be the same for us. But we were determined to give it everything we had. So we made our way up the long steep slopes to the south summit, and then along the quite long narrow ridge which leads towards the top. And halfway along that narrow ridge there's a rock step about 40 feet high, and we knew this could well be the crux of the climb. But I was able to find a way by wriggling up between the rock and the ice, and when I got to the top of the step, that was the first time on the expedition that I was really confident that we were now going to get to the top.
Sir Edmund, I'd read that Tenzing Norgay had been in some expeditions that had got quite close to the summit before, perhaps within 1,000 feet. To lay people, how much is 1,000 feet at that height?
Well, you know, if you've reached 28,000 feet and there's still another 1,000 feet to go, it's a long, long way. The altitude causes you to move very slowly indeed, and as a consequence, time alone makes it difficult for you to cover that last 1,000 feet. And of course we're talking about a vertical 1,000 feet, and many of the approaches to the mountain you have to cover quite long distances along ridges in order to reach it. So you're above 28,000 feet for many hours before you're able to reach the summit. And the effective altitude can be quite dramatic during that period, you know, above 28,000 feet.
How dramatic is it? Does it leave you breathless and so on?
Well, I don't actually remember being all that breathless. We knew we were going slowly. You know, at lower altitude, say in the New Zealand Alps, 1,000 feet is a relatively short distance, unless it is difficult technical climbing. But 1,000 feet, between 28 and 29,000 feet, is a long, long way. and we were moving very slowly, and we knew that we had a long time ahead of us before we could hope to actually set foot on the summit, and so it proved to be. We set out at 6:30 in the morning, and it was 11:30. It was 5 hours of pretty hard, energetic climbing before we finally managed to set foot on the summit.
And do you remember coming towards the summit and knowing it was the summit?
No, the summit, it was very hard to see. When we were on the summit ridge, particularly when we were sitting on the south summit, you could look along this long, narrow ridge with the rock step in the middle and then disappearing into the distance. And you couldn't actually see the top at all. But we knew it was along there somewhere. And once we climbed the rock step, I kept cutting steps. We had to keep down off the crest of the ridge because it was corniced. It was overhanging on the east face. And if we'd stepped on the crest of the ridge, it could have well plummeted away and we'd have fallen 15 or 16,000 feet. So I cut steps down on the left-hand side of the ridge. And then finally I realized that the ridge ahead was dropping away. And I could see in the distance the barren highlands of Tibet. And then I looked up to the left, and there, just above us really, only 40 feet up, was a bit of a rounded, snowy dome, which I realized was the summit. So then it was only more or less a routine matter of a few more whacks with the ice axe, and Tenzing and I moved up, and we stood on top of the mountain. There was no doubt whatsoever that we were there. Every ridge in every direction swept away down below us, and it was quite obvious that we were on top of the world.
It must have been tremendously exhilarating.
Well, you know, I didn't have that sort of feeling of enormous excitement, really. It was more a feeling of considerable satisfaction, really. Satisfaction that we'd finally been successful where many other very good teams had failed. Also, I was very much aware of the fact that we still had to get safely down the mountain again. And both Tenzing and I were very much aware of the need for a safe and careful descent. But one thing I was determined to do, and that was to take photographs down all the leading ridges of the mountain, just to give complete evidence that we'd actually got there. I knew it was a very disbelieving world, so I wanted to have good photographs to show that we had been successful. Unfortunately, my photographs turned out very well.
What else did you do on the summit?
Well, Tenzing actually dug a little hole in the snow, and Tenzing believed that the summit of Everest, that some of the local gods would periodically stop up there and wander around, I guess. And so on the summit he dug a little hole in the snow, and he put a few pieces of chocolate and a few pieces of sweets and so on, more or less as a gift to the gods of the mountain. And as he did this, I remembered down on the South Col, John Hunt, who was exhausted at this stage and about to head down. He got me into his tent and he said, rather embarrassed, he said, "Ed, I must tell you a little story. When I was leaving England, a priest in the local church came to me and said, 'John, if you get to the top of Everest, could I give you this little cross, which you could leave on the summit?' So John Hunt, who was quite religiously inclined really, he thought this was quite a good idea. But he wasn't going to go to the summit. So he said to me, 'Ed, I don't like asking this, but would you mind taking this little cross with you?' Well, I'm not all that strong a religious person anyway, but this was a request I thought was a reasonable one. So I poked the little cross in my pocket, and but I forgot all about it until we got to the top of Everest and I saw Tenzing bearing these little bits of food for the gods of the mountain. Then I remembered the cross, so I produced it, dug a little hole and put it on the summit. So that also remained there on top of the mountain.
And did you plant flags and so on?
Well, yeah, we when we were down at Advanced Base Camp, John Hunt said to me, Ed, would you mind taking up these flags to the summit? And the flags were the United Nations flag, the Union Jack, the Indian flag, and the Nepalese flag. Now, I'm afraid I've never been a great flag waver, and I didn't particularly want to take any flags to the summit. So I said, why don't you ask Tenzing? And so he asked Tenzing, and Tenzing was very happy to carry the flags up. So he wound them round his ice axe, and when we got to the summit, he pushed them down into... First of all, I took a photograph of him standing with the flags waving from his ice axe, and then he removed them and put them in the snow.
How long were you up on the summit for?
We were there 15 to 20 minutes, which doesn't sound very long, but I was quite busy there. I took my oxygen off and took photographs of Tenzing and down all the leading ridges of the mountain, and the time, it seemed quite long actually, the 20 minutes.
What did you do when you reached the top? Did you hug each other, I suppose?
Well, when we got to the top in sort of rather old-fashioned manner, I just put out my hand to shake Tenzing, and we shook hands. But that certainly wasn't enough for him. He threw his arms around my shoulders, and I threw my arms around his shoulders, a little bit embarrassed-like, and we had a good hug on top of the mountain.
I suppose people ask you this, and I suppose it's irrelevant. Did one of you reach the top before the other?
Well, inevitably, I mean, we were a team, we were working together. We had no thoughts about who was going to set foot on top first. It was a matter of complete indifference to us. I mean, as it happened, I cut steps all the way up, but we say we reached the summit together.
Maybe we could talk briefly about the effects of being that high up a mountain. Did you have headaches and so on?
No, we didn't have headaches at that stage. Remember, we were using oxygen, 3 litres a minute, which gave us, added strength and ability. And during the 20 minutes that I was without oxygen on top of the mountain, I didn't really have any discomfort at all. One of the major problems we had to overcome in climbing Everest was this enormous psychological barrier. All the physiologists believed that if you reach the summit of Everest without oxygen, then more than likely you would collapse and just die there because of the altitude. When I took the oxygen off on the summit of the mountain for that 20 minutes, I really didn't have any particular uncomfortable sensations. And it was then I realized that probably someday people would indeed reach the summit of Everest without using oxygen. And this, of course, has proved to be the case.
What about the wind and the cold? Was it severe?
Well, the wind was brisk, but it wasn't a really bad wind. When I took my oxygen equipment off in order to take the photographs, my face, of course, was bare then, and there was this steady breeze carrying sharp icicles blew into my face, and my face was just prickled with these sharp icicles carried in this quite firm breeze. And so it was really quite painful having the oxygen mask removed.
When you're climbing, especially up there, but generally, is the danger the overriding concern the whole time? Is that factor there the whole time?
I believe that fear is one of the important motivating factors in people wanting to climb a big or a difficult mountain. I've always talked to people who are setting out on a difficult task, and if they say to me that I'm absolutely certain that I'm going to be successful, my attitude is, why bother starting? I mean, if you know you're going to be successful, it's hardly worth the effort. We did not know that we were going to be successful, but we just battled on as best we could. So when we got to the top, of course, we did have this great sense of satisfaction that we'd finally achieved it. But that sense of fear is a stimulating factor. It sometimes enables you to do things that perhaps you thought were impossible for you, to overcome technical problems that you thought maybe were beyond your ability. So I think fear is a very good motivating factor. Not to enable you to do foolish things, but to enable you to be stimulated sufficiently to carry on towards the summit.
Did you have plenty of oxygen? I mean, I have read some reports that it was running low and you used 2 bottles from an earlier tent by Evans and so on.
Yeah, no, we had very marginal oxygen, really. It had been planned that we would use 4 litres a minute of oxygen, which is what is sort of normally accepted as the desirable amount. But as our oxygen was not adequate for that, I reduced our supply of oxygen, and we used oxygen at 3 litres a minute. And this, when we got to the South Summit, there was a bit of oxygen had been left there by Evans and Bodillon, and so we were able to use that. And so we got to the top with the 3 litres and a good deal of the way down. We ran out of oxygen well above the South Col, where our support party was, but we were able, I had to cut steps all the way down the couloir to the South Col, and even though I wasn't using oxygen, I think I was reasonably happy with my ability to make my way down.
How difficult is it to go down?
Well, going down is sometimes more dangerous perhaps than going up. Going up, of course, you're battling against the altitude and the height, but coming down, it's often difficult to see where to carefully place your feet. Of course, you're often tired after the ascent. Sometimes there's almost a sense of anticlimax. And I think there may well have been more disasters occurred on the descent than have occurred on the ascent. So going down, you have to be very, very careful indeed.
Going down, can we just talk about where you rejoined the rest of the party?
Well, we came down towards the South Col, and George Lowe and Sherpa were on the South Col acting in support. And George made a thermos flask full of, I think it was tomato soup, and he came up across the South Col towards the bottom of the couloir. And as we came slowly, chipping steps down the couloir, we came towards George, and George, who was my old climbing companion for New Zealand, he said, "How did it go, Ed?" And I said, "Well, George, we knocked the bastard off." Now, when I said those rather, not very polite words, I suppose, I wasn't thinking of the world in general. I was just thinking of my old climbing companion who would understand what I was talking about. George nodded and said, "I thought you must have." And nobody knew about this until we got to London with the party, when we were interviewed by the BBC. And the interviewer asked George, what were the first words that Ed Hillary said when you met up on the South Col? And George, the old so-and-so, "Well, Ed said, we knocked the bastard off." So this statement of mine went all around the world. You know, when we arrived back in New Zealand, my mother said to me, "Edmund, you didn't say those words, did you?" And I had to admit rather miserably that I had indeed said them.
Did you have any idea of the impact on the world and then on you for the rest of your life that climb would have?
I had no conception at all, really. When we climbed the mountain, and even when we came down and joined our friends in the Western Coombe, my feeling was that the mountaineering world in general would be quite interested in our success on the mountain. They might even be quite excited about it. But I didn't even think for a moment about the world in general or the reaction of the media. And it really wasn't until we were about halfway out from Everest to Kathmandu that we started getting mail runners every day with piles of telegrams and letters and cuttings out of newspapers all about the climb. And then I first realized that the climb had indeed had a very big impact around the world. It was then too that I got a letter which was addressed to Sir Edmund Hillary, KBE. Well, I just thought it was some stupid joke, you see, but George Lowe, who's a bit smarter about these things than I am, he realised that it was true. And George laughed and laughed and laughed. He really thought it was very funny. I didn't think it was very funny at all at the time. And I could see myself a rough old beekeeper in Papakura, and I can remember thinking, you know, with a title, a KBE, I'll have to buy myself a new pair of overalls and and have to behave in a respectable fashion. So it was quite a surprise and a shock to me.
Do you think that the fact that it coincided with the coronation added to the impact?
Oh, I don't think there's any question at all about that. It had a big impact not only on the climate, but maybe even also on the coronation. Although we climbed Everest on May 29th, and the coronation was on June the 2nd, it was quite a difficult job getting the news out to Kathmandu. James Morris, our Times press correspondent, he realised that if he really worked hard, he could get the message out in time for the coronation. And with a few Sherpas, he rushed down through the icefall, down to the village of Kathmandu, where there was a radio, and then he sent a message to the British Embassy in Kathmandu. They sent it on the diplomatic radio to London, and it arrived on the evening before the coronation. It was given to the Times newspaper, and then they had to decide whether they would keep the news and just show it themselves in their newspaper, or distribute the news generally to all the press. And very sensibly, actually, they distributed to all the press. So on the morning of the coronation, all the presses had, you know, the coronation, all this, and Everest too. So it was a very appropriate time for it.
But at this time you would have been largely unaware that it was having this much impact back there.
Well, I had no conception at all that it was having this impact. It wasn't until we were approaching Kathmandu and we're getting all these letters and telegrams and cuttings that we realised what a big impact it had.
Would it be fair to say that that climb's dominated your life?
Well, yeah, I mean, was involved in many other exciting activities afterwards, but there's no question at all that the impact that the climb of Everest had on the media and the world in general was certainly had a major change to my way of living.
Not that, I mean, you did plenty afterwards, but obviously you're always referred to as the man that climbed Everest first. Has there ever been a moment in your life when you wished you didn't do it?
No, not really, because I've been able to have a series of exciting and enjoyable adventures, and I've been aware of the fact that the reason that I got much of my support for these activities was because Tenzing and I had reached the top of Mount Everest. So in many ways I was appreciative of the fact that we had finally been able to get to the top.
What do you think made you a good climber? Did you have certain attributes where you were better than a lot of others?
Well, I think I was in those days always very fit. I think I had a great deal of motivation. I was pretty determined as far as climbing went. Combined that with my fitness, and then I think I had a very good natural ability to acclimatise well. And all these things combined together, and with a good companion like Tenzing, I think made us a fairly formidable couple.
Now, obviously, you've returned to that area a lot. Does it have a special lure for you?
Well, it does, because in 1962, when I was back there with an expedition, I was talking to some of the Sherpas, and they had no schools in the area, they had no medical facilities, and I didn't feel sorry for them. I had great admiration for them, but I realised that they lacked all these things that we take for granted. And talking to the Sherpas, I asked them if we could do something, what would they like it to be? And they all agreed that what they wanted more than anything was a school in the village of Kumjung, so that their children could get some education. So I raised some money in the United States, and we obtained a building, and we moved it in there, and we established the Kumjung School. Now this was in 1962, and I really felt that that was it. I was establishing the Kumjung School, and that would be the end of it. But I'm afraid it didn't work out that way. Villagers from many days' walk away kept approaching me, asking for help, and now we have built 27 schools, 2 hospitals, a dozen medical clinics, a couple of airfields, and lots of freshwater pipelines, and it's just gone on and on and on. And it's really become a way of life as far as I've been concerned. And it's given me just as much satisfaction in many ways as reaching the summit of Everest.
When you climbed Everest, did you have to pay to be in the expedition?
No, I didn't pay to be in the expedition, but we didn't get paid either. The funds were raised by the expedition. We even had to pay for some of our own equipment, and it wasn't really till after Everest that any question of financial return came up at all. Nowadays, of course, people are very commercially orientated, but when we got back to London and the discussion occurred about doing extensive lecture programs all around the world, then that for the first time on the whole expedition, the question came up as to whether or not those who did the lecturing would actually get some modest payment. Most of us thought it wasn't a bad idea, and they finally decided that all members of the party who took part in the lecture would receive £25 for each lecture, which is what, about $60 nowadays. And so I did a great deal of lecturing around the world at $60 a pop. Nowadays, of course, nobody would even move out of their house for $60. But I think all of us felt that that was a reasonable recompense. And all the other money that was raised went into a fund called the Everest Fund, and over £100,000 was raised from our efforts, which was used to support other adventurous expeditions over the years.
Going back to that area a lot, was becoming a High Commissioner in India an extension of that for you?
Well, it was a complete surprise to me as well. I was in my office in Auckland here, and the ring on the telephone, and a rather deep voice said, "Can I speak to this is David Longy. Can I speak to Ed Hillary?" Well, I knew who David Longy was, of course, because he'd just been appointed Prime Minister of New Zealand, but I couldn't see any reason why David Longy would be ringing me up. So I said, "Who?" And in a rather peppery tone, David Longy said, "David Longy." So I said, oh, hello. And it was then that he said to me over the telephone that the High Commission in Delhi had been closed down for some years. He felt it should be reopened, and would I be interested in going over as High Commissioner? Well, it was quite a surprise and a shock, I must admit. But it was also, to me, a very attractive idea. I'd spent a lot of time in India and enjoyed India, and I thought that I could probably do a reasonably good job at this particular task. So that's how it all started. And June and I spent 4.5 years in India, and it was one of the best 4.5 years I've ever spent anywhere.
You had other expeditions. I just wonder how they rate for you, the Transantarctic, and then the tractor trip across the South Pole, and jet boating in the Himalayas and so on?
Well, they all had their challenges in a different way. I suppose the climb of Everest and the climb of any mountain, there's perhaps more immediate danger. There's always the possibility that an avalanche will sweep you off or you'll fall and be killed. But on the whole, you're not involved in danger for long periods. In the Antarctic, when we drove to the South Pole, we were travelling for months through areas of crevasses. We always had this constant tension that our Ferguson tractors might break through the bridge of a crevasse. So that sense of tension and remoteness was really very different from the sort of feelings I had on Mount Everest. And even when we took jet boats up the Ganges River, that also was an amazing experience. And not only the challenges of battling up difficult white water in our jet boats, but the very close relationship we developed with the people and the religion of India. In all the great centres where we refueled, there were tens of thousands of people that would come down to see us and see our strange craft who were going up the river. And then always Hindu priests would come down and bless us and bless the boats, because they felt we were carrying out almost a religious pilgrimage on the way up into the Himalayan, where the Mother Ganga started. That was really an absolutely amazing experience. All of us, very few of us, I think, were particularly religiously minded, but I think for a brief while at least, we almost all became Hindus and Buddhists as we travelled up the river.
Sir Edmund, what's it like to have your face on a $5 note? Is that a bit uncanny?
Not really. I was rung up. I was in Toronto when I was rung up about this, and first of all, my comment was that I understood that only people who were dead got their names or their faces in notes like $5 notes, and but I was assured that that was what they would like to do, and as obviously it was a great honour, I was happy to accept. But you know, it really hasn't made any difference at all to me.
They didn't give you a whole lot or anything?
No, they didn't give me. Well, they actually gave me a big sheet, a full sheet that wasn't cut up, which, you know, I think are rather unusual. I actually did suggest to them that they might give me all the old $5 notes, but they didn't seem to think that was such a good idea. But, you know, I handle $5 notes all the time, and I really don't even think about it.